and welcome to this webinar on the topic of rebuilding, the sixth and last in the series of online events titled Russia's War on Ukraine. My name is Marko Pavlyshin. I am an emeritus professor of Ukrainian Studies at Monash University, and I shall be chairing tonight's webinar, which, like the series as a whole, is co-hosted by the Melbourne Eurasianist Seminar Series at the University of Melbourne, the Ukrainian Studies Association of Australia and New Zealand, and the Ukrainian Studies Foundation in Australia. Let me begin by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, traditional owners of the land from which I speak, and by paying my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. In similar spirit, I pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land of Ukraine, who today courageously defend their country against colonial predation, dispossession, and the genocidal threat of extinction of their identity. Today, we turn our attention to the question of rebuilding Ukraine once the war ends, a question that needs to be addressed in anticipation of that much desired state of affairs. Rebuilding means the physical reconstruction or the reconceptualization and construction anew of the built environment that Russian bombs, rockets, and shells have destroyed. But it also means restoring or fashioning in a more sustainable and robust way than before every aspect of Ukraine's life: economic, political, social, and cultural. We're privileged today to welcome as participants in this discussion people eminently qualified to speak with authority on aspects of the theme of rebuilding Ukraine. Professor Torbjörn Becker, Mr. Slava Balbek, and Professor Natalia Kudryavtseva, each of whom I shall introduce prior to their presentation. Our speakers will speak for up to 20 minutes, and I shall give them a signal at the 18-minute mark. Now, I'd encourage members of the audience to put questions to members of our panel. Please type your question using the Q&A function, which you can access through the button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And panelists will respond to questions after the three presentations, but do please submit your questions at any stage of the proceedings. Indeed, the sooner you do this, the better. Now, our webinar will be opened by His Excellency Bruce Edwards, Ambassador of Australia to Ukraine. The ambassador was to have spoken to us live from Europe, but a few days ago, a new commitment arose that prevents him from joining us in real time. Nonetheless, the ambassador has gone to the trouble to pre-record his remarks, and for this we are most grateful. I should say that Bruce Edwards is a career diplomat with Australia's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. He has previously served as deputy head of mission in Port of Spain and Beirut, and has had postings in Kyiv and Kabul. Mr. Edwards holds a Master of Journalism from the University of Queensland, a Master of Arts and a Bachelor of Arts from Melbourne University, a Graduate Diploma Honours in Antarctic and Southern Ocean Studies from the University of Tasmania, and a Graduate Certificate of Humanitarian Leadership from Deakin University. His Excellency Bruce Edwards.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are listening to this today. My name is Bruce Edwards. I'm the Australian Ambassador to Ukraine and to Moldova. I'm very sorry I cannot join you in real time today, but as anyone with particularly good eyesight may be able to discern, I'm in Moldova at the moment and won't be available to speak tomorrow morning when the webinar is taking place. Moldova, much like Ukraine, has also a long, challenging history of dealing with Russia's interference and aggression. and is facing some of the same challenges that Ukraine faces at this time. And Moldova, like Ukraine, has long faced the challenge of living alongside or nearby an aggressive state that has blatant disregard for respecting the territorial integrity and sovereignty of an independent state. And Moldova is looking towards the future, much like Ukraine as well. It's a future that is absolutely and adamantly grounded and oriented towards Europe, towards the West, a country based on the respect and observation of the norms of an international rules-based order. A future where all really people want is to live in peace, to thrive for a better future for themselves and their children, and a country where they can celebrate their culture. I'm very pleased to see in the program tomorrow, in the webinar, that you're dealing with, in just 3 short presentations, that you're dealing with 3 of the central tenets that I believe will be so fundamental as we move forward in Ukraine. There is the short-term needs, the recovery, immediate support and recovery. There is the longer-term, how will reconstruction continue and be sustained over the much longer period. And there is the cultural aspect, which is so fundamental to Ukraine. And I think we are seeing that even during a time of war. We are seeing the absolute bright, shining culture of Ukraine be uppermost at times when we could least expect it. And I think a fundamentally important part of all of this is about respect. And I think you'll see today from the presentation from Baalbek Bureau with Slava, the way in which there are these ongoing efforts that in these worst of times, providing assistance that respects the individual. I've seen some of the short-term housing temporary solutions that Baalbek have been putting together. And these are wonderful places. There's been similar arrangements set up in Lviv, where short-term accommodation is very carefully tailored to ensure that it takes into consideration what families need. And I think this will be an issue writ large going forward in the future. I commend all the presentations today. I thank you for turning up at the audience. Turning up is half the battle. I'm often asked, what can we do? What more can we do? We don't always all have a spare $1 million to put aside to assist Ukraine as much as we wish we did. And part of it is continuing to be engaged, to turning up, to letting your governments know that in the longer term, there is still this desire for Australia and any other governments, governments of countries of residents watching, to be engaged to support Ukraine going forward. Australia has to date supported over $650 million worth of assistance to Ukraine. The majority of that, 2/3 of that, has been in military assistance to ensure that Ukraine can win the war, but much will need to be done. Thank you all for attending. Thank you to the presenters. Thank you to Marco and your team. Best of luck. I look forward to watching the recording once I'm back in Warsaw. Cheers.
We're very grateful to Bruce Edwards for having found the time and made the special arrangements to record that message to us. The first speaker of our webinar is Professor Torbjörn Becker, and the title of his presentation is A Blueprint for the Reconstruction of Ukraine. Professor Becker has been director of the Stockholm Institute of Transition Economics, SITE, at the Stockholm School of Economics in Sweden since 2006. He's a board member of several economics research institutes in Eastern Europe, including the Kyiv School of Economics. Prior to this, he worked for 9 years in the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, where his work focused on international macroeconomic crises and issues related to the international financial system. He holds a PhD from the Stockholm School of Economics, has published in top academic journals, and has contributed to several books and policy reports focusing on Russia and Eastern Europe. Torbjörn, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Marco. It's really an honor, but at the same time, a great responsibility and challenge to speak on the reconstruction of Ukraine in these difficult times. And it's really a responsibility and challenge, not only because it's a very important topic, but also my knowledge would only cover a very tiny part of this rebuilding discussion. But I'm happy that I'm joined by our other speakers here today that will cover some other substantial issues that are involved in this process. Just maybe in addition to Marco's kind introduction here, you may wonder why someone sitting here in Stockholm is involved in this discussion about reconstruction of Ukraine, but it really dates back to 2006 when I came back to Sweden and then traveled to Kiev to be part of the effort of the Kiev School of Economics to build a first-rate economics education institution in Ukraine, focusing on modern teaching in economics, and now this has expanded into business and other areas. So this is how I got involved in this. And then in April already, I was part of an effort led by Yuri Gardnichenko, who is now a professor in Berkeley, but is also an alumni from the Kiev School of Economics, who gathered a number of people that wanted to contribute to this discussion and basically have a plan ready for when we can start the large-scale reconstruction process. And I want to sort of just halt there a minute, because of course the reconstruction process needs to be planned and thought about right now. But for every day this war is going on in Ukraine, the problems and the costs and the suffering is just increasing every day. So I think when we start now in our capitals around the world, thinking about how we can support the reconstruction effort in Ukraine, we first must remember that Ukraine really needs to end this war as soon as possible. So it's really about providing massive support already today for Ukraine's victory in this war. I mean, this is something we always have to remember when we discuss these reconstruction issues. So I'll try to just briefly go through some of the key points that we were making in this report. We are now actually turning this report into a book that is going to be issued by the CPR, I hope in December. But some of the key principles, I will start with how damages have been estimated. This is of course a very important part if you're an economist thinking about what kind of funding do we need to think about to reconstruct Ukraine? How much damage has been done by this war in terms of infrastructure, houses, etc. And now, I'm going to be a little bit narrow in the sense that this part of the discussion that I'm in here is basically about damages that we can sort of measure, put numbers on, or have an idea about. It's not actually taking into account the much greater cost of human suffering and people being killed, displaced, hurt, etc. So with that caveat, I want to mention again that the Kiev School of Economics is very much at the forefront of estimating the damages that are done to Ukrainian infrastructure. Their latest estimate as of September was that damages due to this war is in the order of $130 billion. Okay. You have to excuse me, I'm not quite sure what the exchange rate to the Australian dollar is here, but 130 billion US dollars is just an enormous amount. And for people that may not know the size of the Ukrainian economy, before the war, one year's GDP was roughly 180-90 billion US dollars. So this is more than half of a year's GDP worth of damage, if you put it in the Ukrainian context. The largest part of these damages is the damage done to residential buildings. It's estimated at 50 billion US dollars at this stage, or about 40% of the damage that has been done. Then we have infrastructure in the form of roads and railways. We have destruction of enterprises, companies, agriculture, machinery in agriculture, agricultural lands, education facilities. And then, as we have seen now recently in the last couple of months and weeks, an increasing bill in terms of destruction of energy and utilities that has been very heavily targeted now by the Russians. And of course, all of this damage is caused by the Russian aggressive war in Ukraine. It's no one else's fault. This is what Russia is doing in violation of international laws and agreements, and we'll come back to that a bit later here. But if we link it to the bill of reconstruction, $130 billion, who's going to pay for this? Well, the first obvious answer is, of course, Russia needs to pay for this. Is this realistic? Why would Russia send us money or not us, but Ukraine money once this war is over? Well, at this stage, the sanctions imposed by the EU, the US, Australia, and other partners to Ukraine, these sanctions include freezing assets of the central bank and of different other entities from Russia. The central bank assets alone that have been frozen in the West is more than 300 billion US dollars. So that is a very good starting point in terms of thinking about how do we finance the reconstruction needs in Ukraine. Of course, these frozen assets cannot be transferred sort of overnight to Ukraine, which would have been, nice, but it's very complicated in terms of legal procedures, and these assets are in different jurisdictions, with each country basically having to make laws and having legal proceedings to transfer these funds from Russia to Ukraine. And then we have to remember that compensation to Ukraine is not only going to be about the damages to physical capital, but also to human capital, to suffering, lost incomes, lost investments, trade, etc. So when the Ukrainian government is discussing the needs or the war reparations, the whole bill, it actually adds up to 750 billion US dollars. And this is an amount that was presented at the Lugano conference on supporting the Ukraine. So we can understand that it means that the international donor community really have to make significant contribution in addition to the money that can be taken from the frozen Russian assets in the West. So given these massive amounts, then the question is basically how can the support to Ukraine be organized? How can we deal with this amount of money and mitigate issues of misuse of these funds? Excuse me. Because when amounts are this large, people will want to understand where the money is going, and making sure that there's a governance setup that takes this money from where it comes and make it to good use for the whole Ukrainian society, and not just particular individuals or organizations involved in this. So what we propose in our report is that we should set up a separate agency or organization. We can call it the Ukraine Reconstruction Fund, where the Ukrainian government, of course, should be setting up priorities and making plans, but where all of the international donors should be represented in this organization. And since really the end sort of path of the reforms that Ukraine have been discussing is joining the European Union, in our view, it should be this organization, this Ukraine Reconstruction Fund, needs to have a very strong connection to the European Union. That's not to say that the US or Australia or other partners should not be there, but I think it needs this very strong tie to EU institutions, because this is going to be a very long-term process, and really the end goal of such transformation process is the membership into the EU once Ukraine has won this war. So with this type of institution, donors can coordinate their funding. The priorities can be set together with the Ukrainian government. Then it's also, of course, needed a proper mechanism for procuring all of these buildings, roads, other infrastructure, etc. And then after that, we also should expect that we need a very strong monitoring of progress from this institution to make sure that money is actually spent the way that is to the greatest benefit of the Ukrainian society. Because as many of you know, when you talk about reconstruction in Ukraine in these massive amounts, there's always this question that Ukraine in the past had very significant problems with corruption, and can we really trust that this money is spent wisely? And what we argue in our report is that this must start with an appropriate governance structure in this Ukraine Reconstruction Fund, with international donors and the Ukrainian government together making plans, and then of course monitoring that progress is made in different directions. The other thing that we already hinted about is that the reconstruction process can be done in different phases, or should be done in different phases. And of course, starting already now, and in particular in the areas where there is less fighting going on now, but where people relocate from different parts of Ukraine, there needs to be, of course, housing there. There needs to be infrastructure that supports people over the winter in cold weather, food, water, etc. So this type of reconstruction effort should already be planned and funded, more importantly, right now as we speak. Then, as we will hear, I'm guessing later on, it's also quite an opportunity in some sense that when you have these massive reconstruction efforts coming along, there is this opportunity to build back better, as a lot of people said in the COVID pandemic, but it's now also said in the case of Ukraine. Modernizing large parts of the country, upgrading infrastructure, thinking about climate and environment, thinking about making Ukraine really one of the bright stars of the European Union some years from now, when this reconstruction process has come along some part of the way. Ukraine, as many of you know, have absolutely fantastic opportunities in becoming a very attractive place for also investments from private companies to go. There are many very well-educated, clever, and and entrepreneurial people in Ukraine, that would make it very interesting for companies to come and be part of the reconstruction process in Ukraine. So in some sense, what Ukraine is going through now is extremely grim. It really requires massive support from all of us. I think we have to understand that what we do now is not only an investment in Ukraine, but it's actually an investment for the whole democratic world, and in particular, of course, for all of the countries around Ukraine in Europe. For us here, we can all sense the need of urgency, and that this is about something more than a war against Ukraine. This is a war against democratic societies around the world that Russia has started. So we should all join forces, provide Ukraine with the support that we can today, and it's actually not that large as some people think, because our economies are so much bigger than the Ukrainian economy. So if we actually support Ukraine at a decent level, it only actually amounts to some tenths of percents of the GDPs of countries in the West. So for example, when we're talking about short-run macroeconomic support today, the number that's going around is Ukraine needs about $50 billion US. This sounds like an enormous amount, but it's really only some tenth of a percent of the combined GDPs of EU and the US. And again, the alternative is really that we let Russia win this war and continue these attacks on democratic societies and people that want to live in peace and freedom. And this is not something we can afford. So we really need to make great investments supporting Ukraine today. And down the road, we should be a strong partner to the reconstruction process in Ukraine and make it a very successful country in the European Union. Thank you. I will stop there.
Thank you very much indeed, Torbjörn, for that illuminating paper, which pointed out the scale of the task that is ahead of Ukraine and the world, but also the fact that the task is by no means beyond reach, that it is something that the rich countries of the world can afford without batting an eyelid, and pointing out that what is at stake is, of course, nothing more and nothing less than the political and economic system that we value. So thank you very much indeed once more, Torbjörn. Ladies and gentlemen, our second panelist, Mr. Slava Balbek, is an eminent Ukrainian architect and founder and CEO of the Kiev-based architecture and interior design studio, which is called Balbek Bureau. And his portfolio includes the Kyiv food market, is located in a repurposed military arsenal. In San Francisco, the 906 World Cultural Center, which is in a century-old church, and also the scenography for the Chernobyl Journey multimedia exhibition in Kyiv. So Balbek Bureau, led by Slava Balbek, has won multiple international accolades and awards, such as the Architecture Master Prize and the Hospitality Design Award. And very importantly, for the context of today's webinar, since the start of Russia's full-scale war on Ukraine, Slava Balbek's team has been crafting special projects in response to the challenges inflicted by the war. And these initiatives, including a dignified temporary housing solution for internally displaced people, and a monument protection system are combined under the banner of the RE Ukraine system. And in the publicly available materials advertising this webinar, you can find links to the Baalbek Bureau projects that I've just mentioned, and I can recommend that you look these up after the webinar. Slava Baalbek will address us on the topic of rebuilding in wartime, how local architects shape Ukraine's future while also preserving the past. Over to you, Slava.
Thank you. First of all, thank you. And it's an honor to be in such a panel discussion. I will share my screen and I will continue with the presentation, not to lose time. So what it's about to rebuilding is in wartime. First of all, a few words about ourselves, about our architectural practice. We know well right now that we can divide ourselves into different phases. First phase, since we just organized the Baalbek Bureau from the 2009, and after the 24th of February. This is our team for now. I think it's about over 60 employees. It's a team of young professionals. We've been myself practicing for 15 years for the architecture. Actually, we're trying to cover all over the world. We do have projects in States. We do have projects in China, in Europe. So, and we don't have some specific field of our practice, but the adaptive reuse, for example, like you tell us, the key food market is about to rethink, reshape, or something like this, renovate brick by brick some old factories to some new functions. For example, the 906 World, this is San Francisco Old Church, which we renovated a few years ago. We don't have a scale. We don't have a scale of the project. I mean, it doesn't matter what's the size of it. For example, to create some architectural proposals for the old tanks in Antarctica is also interested for our bureau. So you can see we are actually trying to cover all of the aspects of the architecture. What's going on from the 24th of February? We know well that millions and millions of Ukrainians were forced to leave their homes. So as many of us did too. So now you can see how does our bureau look like. So you can see that all of our team were forced to leave the country or just drive away to the safe and western part of Ukraine. But actually, we're trying to continue work as the team remotely. So if you're an architect, how you can help Ukraine? From ourselves, we divided, and actually we start working, I think, from the second weeks of full-scale invasion. It was 10th of March when we just started. We just grab ourselves and try to be helpful. So we divide all the solutions on 3 different phases. The emergency solutions, which should be implemented in a couple of weeks or months. The temporary solutions, which can be implemented in 3 months up to a year, and the permanent solutions, which can be implemented widely and actually on a much more bigger scale. So from us, we would like to take challenge to do the temporary solutions and to do it with the dignity, and temporary solutions should be done to have a time for permanence. So we don't have any time to implement the emergency ones with the living, with the fixing the infrastructure, because actually we don't have the resources for this. But to create some temporary solutions and do it systematically, the really important thing to do the proposals and to work on the solutions which can be implemented in a higher scale, not to try to be effective on one point or one street or on one house, to do the system of solutions which can be implemented in much wider scale. So that's how we came with the Re-Ukraine system. Actually, let me just grab this thing. Now on, it's 4 different systems, from the housing to monuments, memorials, and the villages. And I will briefly tell you about two of the system. What means for us the system? The Re-Ukraine housing, it is a temporary housing system for displaced person. But the big idea of all of this system levels is the dignity no matter what. It doesn't mean, it doesn't matter where you were relocated, what you've been lost, how do you feel before, but the main thing of this, you should done it with dignity, and all the solutions should be dignified. So, and our mission in this project of the Re-Ukraine system housing, we're trying to raising the standard of temporary housing. I mean the temporary, not the emergency one. I'm not speaking about the containers or something like this. And for us, we are trying to rise up the standard. We want to increase the standard of the temporary housing living. We came up with such a visualization of the village of the temporary displaced people. As you can see, it's a simple and soft architecture. So the key features of this project is enhancing comfort plus socialization, and this is the really main aspect, because we think that it's not only about the square footage that you can be given by the government. It's about for fixing and recovering your mental health. So it should be kind of treatment architecture. So it's really important that you have a chance to socialize, have a chance to continue living, place to work, place to play with your children. It's not only about be given for the square footage of the personal space while you lost all your social connection. So that's why the enhanced comfort plus socialization. The other feature is flexibility. We made it from models, so all the size, all the dimensions of the building. It's made from the model scale. I mean modular scale, so it can be easy implemented and projected. For example, for different configuration for the site or relief. And sustainability, it's a other aspect which help us to relocate it, to build it up fast, to build it up from the local materials, and to be relocated. For example, it can be built up beside the bombed or hit or destroyed cities, use it for a few years, and then it can be easily relocated for the other space, other territory, other territory for needs. So this is a principle which shows you the difference in between standard minimum, which is just world practice, to the minimal comfort. So for us, minimum comfort is adding some shared spaces, is increasing the norms and rules for all the facilities that you're using daily. And this is the key features. We developed up to 12 different scenarios of living, trying to and continue working on this. And we made the different working documentation for each of them, because we know well there is no unique there is no standard living scenario for people. Every time it's different. So we're trying to cover as much as it possible, just that people feel comfort there. So where we go now with this project, we are on the way of building up the housing, the pilot project for 15 families. It's situated in Bucha. And what are the goals of this? To build it up model, one by one scale model, to show the principles alive. So it's not only about making the project on paper or on Instagram or something. We are trying to build up the real model. There will be experimental living for families for yearly. There will be a team of Ukraine observers, which will get a feedback from the people what it's about to be relocated in a comfort area, in a comfort system of living. This is the system of living. It's not only about the footage that you have. So it consists from 3 different parts. One of this is the communal residential block, and other is apartment type residential block, where you can feed up the small family. And we do have the outdoor workshop, which gives us an opportunity to experiment with the materials, with the different typology of the building sites. I mean, if the other topic, if we want to implement the solution in a wider scale, we don't need to be focused on one specific construction typology. For example, the main typology for us is the wooden framing, but as well we made a project to do it in SIP panels, to do it is in sandwich panels, or is aluminum structural. So this is the outdoor workshop, which give us the opportunity to check and relocate it, build it, and mount it and unmount it, to be sure that's what we are doing on the pilot ones. This is the best solution which can be implemented in a wider scale. This is the visualization, and now on we just nearly finished the paperwork for all of the process, and we are ready to start constructions. And actually, we are on the process of fundraising to cover for full-scale constructions. For now, we just raised up only 25% of necessaries, but we will start up with foundation and the structural works immediately in this month. This is the visualization of actually, and the government of the Bucha gives us this land. It's a land for free for us. So we will build it up, use it for a year for our experiment. And then all of this architecture and all of this solution will remain there just to use as the necessaries, public necessaries. So this like this. What is about the permanent solutions? We took a chance to think about the Ukrainian villages, small villages, not the highest big city infrastructure principles, but the small Ukrainian villages which are really damaged by the war. For now, only in Kyiv region, there's over 5,000 houses, private houses were destroyed over the war, and it's continued daily, as you know, while the front line is moving across the Ukraine, all the fights and shelling and artillery just hitting the small houses. And we took a chance for us to give a solution how we can give us proposals to rebuild it in a wider scale. So we traveled all over we took the pilot project for the rebuilding and renovating houses in Kyiv region. So that's for us meeting the traditional architecture with digital ones. So the project mission is to simplify the restoration and destroyed and damaged private houses, and to do it with the respect with the local context. It's about finding the design code of small Ukrainian villages. So we took the different categories of the elements, for example, like a roof inclination, window framing, color palette, etc., and put it in some online builder. And actually we are in progress on this, and it took us a lot of time to make a project, the design architectural project without design and architecture. It's only about putting all of these categories. It will help while it will be started, and I hope it will be started in November, actually at the end of November. The main aim that the people who want to rebuild, there is lots of volunteers, and even in a government level is a plan to rebuild it. So you just choose the region, for example, the Kyiv region, and then you have the specific options to choose all the color palettes. So this is and you can generate the architecture in 5 or 7 minutes. You will get the old drawings, you will get the old recommendation, the colors, the sizes, and etc. And you can continue rebuilding or renovating destroyed houses, and it will be according with the design code of the specific region. So, and you can make 100,000 of different solutions according for specific region. So is it too early to start rebuilding? Of course, and it's yes and it's no, because the war is still going on and we're still is under attack. So, but we don't need, and we can't waste our time to wait. If you are here and you have resources to continue working, to take analysis, you should do it. So what can we do while the war still lasts? So we can do analysis, we can continue with developing methodological ways of restoration. We can create reconstructional and commemoration concepts. We can explore the new technologies. That we are living in a new world, and actually the world doesn't have the experience how is to rebuild the country under the war, until while the war is going on with the new technologies. So this is the contemporary technological war. So it means that the reconstruction should be on the technological way. So we don't have, the world doesn't have the experiments right now, but we need to create some forums, some panel discussion to continue work with this. And how can people from other countries help with Ukraine to rebuild it? So for sure, it's about sharing the experience and the consulting local architects and urban planners. It's an offering to Ukraine to study and the research opportunities. It's a provide as a tech support, as I told you before, and of course it's donate for reconstruction. So we need an advice, we need a help. We would like to learn how to use our skills, how to use our resources to continue working here. So what is a vision of Ukraine for the future? It should be an accessible, sustainable, comfortable, technological, and dignified country. Thank you. This is it. This is it for my presentation. So this is the sample of few local initiative who is working on the restoration projects in Ukraine right now. Let's be in touch, and thank you for your time.
Thank you very much indeed, Slava, for that remarkable window into what you and your team are doing already, and into the visions that you have of what can be done in the future. I am hopeful that there are those in our audience who will be inspired by your list of ways in which people in other countries can help the process of physical reconstruction, creating practical, but very importantly, dignified living opportunities for Ukraine after this terrible war is finished, and even before then. Thank you once more. Our third and final speaker, ladies and gentlemen, is Professor Natalia Kudryavtseva, whose presentation is titled Rebuilding the Linguistic Landscape, a New Approach to Ukrainianization in Ukraine. Professor Kudryavtseva is the Professor of Translation and Slavic Studies at Kryvyi Rih State Pedagogical University in Ukraine. Her research focuses on language policy, identities, and Ukrainian language education. And her recent work explores how Ukrainian can be offered to speakers of Russian, how common perceptions of language, language ideologies, in other words, affect Russian speakers' willingness to learn and use Ukrainian in Ukraine. Now, Professor Kudryavtseva has published in international journals, and she's written for the United States Kennan Institute's Focus Ukraine blog. She held a Fulbright scholarship at Kennan in 2009. She has also held fellowships at the University of Cambridge in 2013, and very recently at the Alfred Krupp Institute for Advanced Study in Greifswald, Germany. Now, Professor Kudryavtseva is currently in Kryvyi Rih in Ukraine, and Russia's attacks on Ukraine's civilian infrastructure have made the power supply and the stability of internet connections uncertain. Because of this, Professor Kudryavtseva has pre-recorded her presentation. She is, however, present at the webinar, and all being well, as we hope, will participate live in the question and answer session. So we will now listen to the pre-recorded talk by Professor Natalia Kudryavtseva.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to speak about a new way to the so-called Ukrainianization of Ukraine. In October 2022, the Secretary of the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine, Alexei Danilov, claimed that the Russian language must disappear from the linguistic landscape of Ukraine. Linguistic landscape understood here as various languages spoken on a particular territory. On the national telephone, Danilov stated, "The Russian language must completely disappear from our territory as an element of enemy propaganda and brainwashing of our population. English is compulsory. Our native language is compulsory, while the imposing of these Russian narratives is very dangerous, as if we should come to terms with them, as if we should understand something. Look, we do not need anything from them. We want them to leave us alone. We want them to go back to their swamps and croak in their Russian language there." The so-called cancelling of Russian has been more and more prominent in Ukraine since the beginning of the full-scale Russian invasion. The language ombudsman Taras Kremin suggested that the lessons of Russian should be changed for some other lessons at Ukrainian schools starting from the 1st of September this year. As a result, several regions and cities of Ukraine, including Kyiv, cancelled Russian language teaching in their schools, as well as both the compulsory and optional lessons of Russian. And in Ternopil, even songs in Russian were banned from the city streets, while locals had been reported to dislike hearing compositions in Russian. This and other similar cases indicate an ever-growing shift in Ukraine's linguistic landscape, which is gradually being rebuilt into a mostly Ukrainian language one. This rebuilding has already been underway since the time of the Euromaidan that took place in 2013-2014. This time saw an unprecedented demand for accessible opportunities to learn Ukrainian among adult speakers of Russian, especially in the southeast of Ukraine. The Euromaidan and subsequent acts of Russian aggression in the Crimean Peninsula and across the easternmost parts of Ukraine were perceived as consciousness-raising events that compelled many more people to learn Ukrainian, or if bilingual, to switch to it in everyday use. This demand was met by a volunteer initiative Free Ukrainian Language Courses, безкоштовні курси української мови, that had launched a couple of years before. The courses started as in-person classes held mostly in libraries, in the evenings, and at weekends during the day. Before the full-scale invasion, these courses were the first and only program which specifically targeted Ukraine's adult speakers of Russian and promoted the teaching of the Ukrainian language to them. The courses are currently operating online and have attracted even more people since the February of 2022. Unlike the traditional pattern, where Ukrainian is taught as a native language to all students alike, disregarding the language they speak at home, in the free Ukrainian language courses, Ukrainian is positioned not so much as a native language or the language to identify with, but as a means of everyday, regular communication. In the traditional pattern, the central socializing locus is corrective feedback, targeting students' use of Russian words and Russian-influenced forms in Ukrainian, since the pattern is shaped by the imperative of the pure language being a symbol of a distinct Ukrainian nation and independent state. The traditional view frames native languages as belonging to nations and also implies that what is valued is not simply Ukrainian, but standard Ukrainian, while mixed Ukrainian-Russian usage is unacceptable and stigmatized. In the approach developed by the volunteer instructors in the free Ukrainian language courses, Ukrainian is taught as a second language and positioned primarily as a means of communication, and only then a language to identify with. This makes non-standard use and hybrid Ukrainian-Russian practice generally acceptable, though using only Russian in class is not tolerated much. The ideological background of the course's Ukrainian language instruction is similar to the one described in ethnographic studies on the teaching of heritage languages in complementary schools. The approach to teaching heritage languages involves both of the above-mentioned perceptions of language as an identity marker and as a communication tool. The view of language as an identity marker argues for the separation of languages, which is common in educational settings having language as content as an institutional aim. This had been referred to as separate bilingualism by Chris and Blackledge, which means that it is good to know more than one language, but these languages should always be kept apart. The other position grounds on the speaker's agency and presents languages as fluid and overlapping, which is consistent with the language as the communicative action view. This has been known as flexible bilingualism or translanguaging, which is an arrangement that normalizes bilingualism without diglossic functional separation. I will now show a couple of excerpts from the free Ukrainian language classes, a part of my data from 12-month observation of their classroom instruction, which took place in Kherson in 2020 and 2021. The shift of the emphasis from the language for identification to the notion of language as a communication tool allows to view the student's first language, Russian, not as an obstacle, but as a resource in the acquisition of their second language, Ukrainian. At the same time, socialization into the Ukrainian nation remains important, which results in the transformation of the traditional monolingualism into the separate bilingual model, the one I just described. Excerpt 1 serves as an illustration of separate bilingualism, realized in the instructor's insistence that his students speak Ukrainian in her class, thus giving Ukrainian the status of classroom language. This excerpt starts with the student relating a story of her daughter's experience with the music school. The student begins in Ukrainian, but quickly switches into Russian, and the rest of her narrative is exclusively in Russian. The instructor interrupts the student by saying, "Не спішіть, повільніше. Don't hurry, speak slower," by which she means don't tell the story in Russian, in which the student is of course much more fluent. And then the instructor explicitly says, "Українською, speak Ukrainian." As is clear from excerpt 2, speaking Ukrainian in the case of this student is far from speaking pure language, since she frequently uses non-standard forms and engages in hybrid Ukrainian-Russian practice. Still, the instructor categorizes her hybrid speech as Ukrainian and recognizes even this low level of proficiency, endorsing the student as a legitimate speaker of both Ukrainian and Russian. In this excerpt, the same student tells the story of her son's childhood experience with the music school, which he eventually quit. This time, the student is speaking Ukrainian using various non-standard forms, which could be classified as mistakes by advocates of purist ideologies. The students use so-called Russianisms, всё, музикальної, музикальну, Ukrainian words that follow Russian phonology, сподобається, повернеш, хочу, Russian syntactic constructions, в музикальну школу ходити, and non-standard Ukrainian forms such as вчительки instead of вчительці. But the instructor corrects only the Russianized form музикальна for музична. She first responds to the content of what the student said in line 10, and only later does the correction, explaining how to differentiate between these words in Ukrainian collocations, музична школа, music school, and музикальний слух, an ear for music. In Russian, there is only one form, музыкальный, and it is used in both the cases. Though correction takes place, except with an example of flexible bilingualism, the ideology also known as translanguaging, in which the emphasis falls on communicating meaning, and correction is limited. This also makes the case for the interplay of ideologies of separate and flexible bilingualism, that is, while the instructor endorses separate bilingualism, insisting on using Ukrainian only, she is still flexible about what counts as Ukrainian in her class. In the free Ukrainian language courses classrooms, students frequently use Russian, and in fact, excerpt 1 is the only time when I heard the instructor explicitly insisting on speaking Ukrainian. However, in one of our conversations, she mentioned that she tries not to allow prolonged use of Russian in her class. Students may often start answering in Ukrainian, then switch to Russian for a couple of phrases, and then switch back to Ukrainian without being interrupted or corrected by the instructor. The switchover may even occur within a single utterance, where a Russian word may be inserted into a Ukrainian phrase or vice versa. In her interview, the instructor explains that in her opinion, she does not have the right to oblige the students to speak only Ukrainian in class. Our aim is not to oblige the students, but to give this knowledge of the language to them. And then the students themselves will use it when they are ready. If I oblige them to speak only Ukrainian, this will frighten away the students and they won't develop further. They may even quit the course because they will feel insecure. Moreover, they are adults and they wouldn't like to look silly. I think this, meaning bilingual practice, conforms with the specifics of our region. It may not be appropriate somewhere in Western Ukraine, but this is perfectly normal for the southern region, she says. To engage the students, the instructor needs to accept flexible bilingualism, whereby Ukrainian and Russian are used interchangeably without functional differentiation. The student's first language, Russian, also comes as a resource, which the instructor uses to effectively teach Ukrainian. Very often I have to explain the Ukrainian language with the help of Russian terms or words. Often people simply don't know what is subject and predicate in Ukrainian, and I need to explain it in Russian. And this is a very effective technique. People know their language, and using it as an instrument, we explain the Ukrainian language to them. Our students know Russian very well. It's easier for them to learn like this. It is especially important at the very beginning, in their first classes. In one of the classes, the instructor uses translanguaging to explain how to speak about time in Ukrainian. Except 3 is another case for the interplay between the ideologies of separate and flexible bilingualism. The instructor starts her explanation by counterposing the ways of denoting time in Ukrainian and Russian. She first gives an example in Russian, «Сколько время?» What is the time? And then says that the same formulation is incorrect in Ukrainian, if translated literally from Russian. In her interview, the instructor explains that this technique sets a name of showing how different these languages are, and that it also demonstrates that Ukrainian is an independent language. It is separate from Russian and self-sufficient. A couple of moments later, as she continues her explanation, the instructor compares the ways of denoting time in Ukrainian and Russian again. But contrary to the preceding instance, she points to their similarity by saying, «Это как знаете 5 минут первого». In Russian, it's like 5 minutes past 12. It should also be noted that in line 11, the instructor performs translation from Ukrainian into Russian. She translates line 9, 5 хвилин на першу, 5 minutes past 12, which is in Ukrainian. And this might be because she expects that some of her students may not understand the phrase in Ukrainian, and the translation is supposed to help them understand what she's speaking about. So what does this approach to promoting Ukrainian can tell us about the rebuilding of Ukraine's linguistic landscape into a mostly Ukrainian-speaking one in terms of everyday language use? The Free Ukrainian Language Courses approach recognizes their students' first language Russian as their language, meaning that Ukrainian comes as a second, or in some rare cases, even as a foreign language for them. The shift from socializing Ukrainian as an identity marker to highlighting its value as a means of communication entails a tolerant view of non-standard use and hybrid Ukrainian-Russian practice, which works as an inclusion strategy necessary to entice Russian speakers into learning Ukrainian, help them feel more confident when they're speaking it, and condition a lasting language transition for them. The nearest stage in the rebuilding process thus seems to be a Ukrainian-Russian bilingualism, since Russian cannot be imagined to be momentarily cancelled, but rather gradually superseded by Ukrainian in various social domains. This ultimately suggests a normalization of the idea of a multilingual community, whereby Ukraine's minority languages and some foreign languages, such as English, will come to the fore. I would also like to acknowledge the support of the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, University of Alberta, and the Hansa Institute for Advanced Study in Delmenhorst, Germany, provided for my project on promoting Ukrainian to Ukraine's adult speakers of Russian. Thank you.
Well, that was the recording of Professor Natalia Kudryavtseva's speech. I see that Natalia is present with us. The internet is holding up, so we're very glad that Natalia will be able to take part in discussion and to respond to questions. I invite the audience to use the Q&A function by sort of clicking on the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen to enter your questions or comments. At this stage, we have just one comment. I will mention, however, that Slava Balbek has had to leave the webinar, for which he sends us his apologies. So if it comes to issues concerning the physical rebuilding, the architectural and construction side of things, we will surely be glad to receive comments, but Slava won't be available to respond to these to any questions. As I said, we already have a question from Uldis Ozolins, which is for Torbjörn, and that question is: a significant percentage of the lawyers and financial advisors in financial centers like London are devoted to defend Russian interests. How easy will it be to unlock the frozen Russian assets without years of legal wrangling?
Thank you. Yeah, I'm guessing that you would like me to respond to this, and of course I'm an economist and not a lawyer. Maybe I would just make two comments on this. First of all, I don't think we should expect anything to be easy. Just to make clear that, you know, we have big plans, and we have plans for reconstructing Ukraine. We have plans for seizing assets. None of these things are going to be easy. So, I mean, let's just be honest about this. But it doesn't mean that we should not pursue those both battles in Ukraine, but also battles in the legal sphere. What I maybe can add as an economist is basically also that, you know, lawyers do work for money, actually. So I think also in this reconstruction process and seizing Russian assets, if sort of Russian oligarchs or the Russian state is paying lawyers to defend their interest, we should of course put up at least as much money to get the lawyers that we need to fight this battle in the legal sphere. So just as with anything in this war, it's about resources, and we are going to provide, I think, Ukraine with the resources to win also the legal battles when they come along. So I don't think we should just walk away from the legal battle. We should just provide the resources basically needed to win also the legal battle. That would be my very quick remark on this. Thank you.
And if I might use my privilege as the chair, Torbjörn, can I ask about the historical background of such major post-war reconstruction efforts as the one that you envisage? Should we be looking at precedents? I mean, does the experience of Europe after the Second World War have any relevance for present conceptions of the future reconstruction of Ukraine?
Absolutely, yes, and this is something we also discussed in the paper. One of the co-authors of the report is Barry Eichengreen, who has been studying in particular the Marshall Plan and what happened in the reconstruction of Europe after the Second World War. And there are some important notes on this, which is that also with the Marshall Plan, there was a separate unit coordinating and being the administration in this rebuilding process. So it became sort of a separate office dealing with the funds and the reconstruction after the Second World War. And I think this is a very important example of how the framework should be set up in thinking about how do we organize donors in combination with the Ukrainian government to make sure that the right priorities are made, that we have monitoring to sort of take care of corruption concerns, etc., etc. There are, of course, a lot of other examples in history that we also should learn from, but of course not repeat the mistakes. And I think we all know that the reconstruction processes in Afghanistan or Iraq and places like that have been not so successful, to put it mildly. But again, we should remember, because people make these remarks now, look at what happened in those countries, but we should remember that Ukraine is a very different country and a different situation than what we have in those not so successful cases of reconstruction. Basically because we think and we're quite sure about the fact that Ukraine is now much more united as a country than some of these other countries that have been not so successful in reconstruction. So one thing the war has really done for Ukraine is really a sense of unity, a sense of common purpose within Ukraine, which I think is going to help the reconstruction process as we go forward.
Thank you very much for that answer, Torbjörn. I see that there is a question from Andrew. In relation to the last question, how can we ensure Ukraine is not beholden to foreign investors for years to come as part of the process of rebuilding?
So was the question how we can make foreign investors come to Ukraine and be part of the process, or?
No, the question is rather the opposite. How do we ensure that Ukraine is not exploited then by foreign investors?
But yeah, I think sort of the key to this is, of course, that in this agency, the Reconstruction of Ukraine Fund, or whatever we want to call it, the Ukrainian government should be the ones there representing, of course, people of Ukraine, and at the other side of this process, the Ukrainian government will be elected in democratic elections. You will have a strong civil society in Ukraine. We can see how many people are already involved in the discussions in the Ukrainian society. So I think, it's going to be a strong ownership of the Ukrainian society in this reconstruction process. And then, of course, Ukraine will have its own laws and rules for how you enter the country. I don't think, I wouldn't be so afraid of, exactly this, that too many foreigners are coming there to exploit Ukraine. I don't see that as the main scenario. I think actually the main scenario today is how can we provide physical security in the first at the first sort of phase of this, both for Ukrainian investors, people, and foreign investors that would like to come to Ukraine. I don't think we are going to have massive foreign investments or Ukrainian investments until we have a little bit greater sense of physical security and basically understanding how we can protect against Russian attacks on the country. So I mean that's going to be the short run issue. And then of course in the next phase it's about the institutional setup to make Ukraine an attractive place also for foreign investors to come. And I think what we have seen in many transition countries is that foreign investment has really been a catalyst to growth and you know the success into EU, etc. So I'm thinking about foreign investment as sort of a success factor for Ukraine rather than a problem. But of course, it's up to Ukraine to set up a framework that prevents, you know, foreigners taking advantage somehow of this reconstruction process. But I don't see that. That's my biggest fear, actually.
Thank you very much, Torbjörn. I renew my invitation to members of the audience to type their questions into the Q&A. In the meantime, I'd like to direct a question of my own to Natalia, and to, in fact, to refer to the leading theme of Slava's paper, which was dignity, building accommodation that respects the dignity, not just the practicality, but the dignity of the person who is going to be using the facility created in the interim as one waits for more permanent residence. It seems to me, Natalia, that the method of teaching Ukrainian to Russian speakers, in fact, also emphasizes the dignity of the learner, that it takes the person as they have come, and their skills and knowledges as a resource to be valued and to help them achieve a goal that they see as desirable. And in this context, I wonder how you view the very sharp, if one may put it this way, rhetoric of some of the more extreme variants of cancel culture that have been directed against, well, Russian culture in general, but in particular the Russian language. Are these expressions likely to be counterproductive, or is it the case that the psychological situation in Ukraine and the sense of being threatened by an enemy is so powerful that these are the right kind of notes to hit at the moment?
Well, in terms of canceling Russian culture, this is all understandable. This can be understood. And I think I might even say that this is to a certain extent natural, that these processes are now taking place. That this is something that we should expect to take place. And in terms of this rhetoric, of course, when it comes to language transition, people who have been speaking Russian for the whole of their lives, they will find it as something intimidating, and they will find it, I think, as frightening them away. As the instructor said in her interview, this might frighten them away and they will never come back to these courses. So, because why is that? Because if we obviously all view the Russian language as a part of the Russian culture, for these people who I interviewed, I mean the people in the courses, the attendees of the students of these courses, and I've interviewed many of these people who had been in the courses before the outbreak, the full-scale invasion, and who are now still attending these courses online, and some new people who arrived after the February full-scale invasion. Those people say in their interviews that, but my Russian, it is not the Russian spoken in Moscow. My Russian is different. So they don't really see, or maybe they wouldn't like to see themselves as being close to that language in Russia. So they want, first of all, they want clearly to drive away from Russia and not recognize their Russian language as that Russian language that is being cancelled and that should be ousted from Ukraine. But in some other way, they are still retain it as their language. For them, language is differently not a part of culture in this respect, but for them it's just their habitual way of speaking. And they're trying to reduce, they tell me that people who are undergoing this transition, when we think about switching into a different language, yes, and I'm speaking about everyday life, which is quite different from when you, for example, use Ukrainian at work because you are required to do it as a civil servant, and then you come home and you use Russian with in all the other spheres of life. When we imagine a lasting transition, meaning switching from Russian into Ukrainian 24/7 and speaking at 24/7, this can't take place just in a moment. For example, when you are finished with these courses, when you graduate and you receive a certificate, is that you are now proficient in Ukrainian, you are able to automatically switch. No, that's much more to psychology than to just your ability and to your knowledge of the Ukrainian grammar and vocabulary. So what people in these courses, the attendees, what they told me in their interviews is that they try to reduce the amount of Russian. For example, they told me that now I speak Ukrainian at home. This is a major part for them because usually the language spoken at home is the most convenient, is the easiest language to use for people. So I've switched to Ukrainian at home, but you know, sometimes I still have to switch back to Russian. And I don't know whether it really happens for them because there is a situation where everyone will speak Russian and they just don't feel comfortable still speaking Ukrainian, or that sometimes they are just so tired. And it also matters when you speak a language which is not your first language, when you're just really exhausted. And I know that being a teacher of English, and I teach all my classes in English, and after 3 classes in English, I really feel, kind of tired just from being concentrated on speaking English all the time. So I can really understand that people just, when they're really tired, they cannot just maybe give them just space and just speak Russian a little bit because it just don't apply. So what I want to say, it is a process for these people. And of course, these courses, as you observed, it takes into account, tries to take into account all of these things, the psychological things, the psychological barrier that many people just, it's not that they are not able to speak Ukrainian, but just they are afraid to speak it because they are afraid to make mistakes. And that other people will judge, and that people will not hear, not listen to the content of what they are saying, but will listen to the form and correct their mistakes, and they will judge them on, because we still have these ideologies, that things that I look at, these language ideologies, that if you speak bad Ukrainian, that you may have some bad thinking. This somehow constantly relates to person's thinking and their worldview. If you speak Surjik, that you're definitely not a real Ukrainian or something like that. And people feel these ideologies. They're always in the air, and they always think about, what if I make a mistake? What if I use a Russian word? Which is inevitable when people just start learning Ukrainian, when they start their switch over. It's just, you cannot avoid that. You will still, insert, even involuntarily, you will still insert some Russian words. And this is just unavoidable. And the approach in this course is just basically to recognize these people as they are. Well, Ukrainian is not their first language, obviously, and it's not their, in this meaning, it's not their native language. Though most of them will, of course, come and tell you, no, Ukrainian is my native language because this and this and this, though I've spoken Russian for the most of my time, it just happened to me like this. Just to recognize these people as they are, and not to try to tell them that you must do this and this and this, but just to entice them, as the instructor says, this, I just want to attract these people and I just want them to stay in my courses. And so she intuitively develops this approach. This is all pure intuition for her and for other instructors. There is no well-developed framework for teaching these people, for approaching these people. And as there are people who have been in these courses for many years. They, for example, started in 2014 after the Crimea, these things in Crimea and in Donbass, and they're still in these courses. It makes me think that this is effective and that this is something that really works for them. And I also might want to add that after the February invasion this year, there have come to the courses, there have come some people from Russia, even as these courses are online. So anyone may join. And there are a few people from Russia, Russian people from Russia, who want to learn Ukrainian. And they're so eager to do it. And I was surprised, of course, I already interviewed one of them. And I was thinking myself that how, with all these things, how to approach this person, how to speak to this person. We held the interview in Ukrainian, of course it was anonymous. And the person said that the reason that I want to learn Ukrainian is because I don't want to be Russian. No one wants to be a Russian these days. So, you find all of these motivations in this process, the identity theme and the communication theme, and you see how these two are connected. And really, when you speak about attracting people to a different language, I mean, from Russian to Ukrainian, and enticing people into this, and when you want to initiate a lasting switchover, you should always balance. There are no direct and simple decisions. You should always balance it. How I try to show in my excerpts, how the instructor always balances between drawing lines. This is Russian, this is Ukrainian, because these are two different languages, two different identities. And sometimes you just need to accept this one word Russian, the other word Ukrainian, and then another word Russian, because it's just for people to, then they speak. If she says no word in Russian, then they will just sit silent. That's the last thing she wants in this course. Thank you for your question.
Yes, I'm sure that a great deal of what you've just told us, Natalia, will resonate very much with listeners of Ukrainian background in Australia who confront the fact that they are in fact better speakers of English than they are of Ukrainian, and they confront all sorts of obstacles that make it difficult for them to speak Ukrainian, even though they have certain skills in Ukrainian speaking, for example, in an official or in any kind of formal context. And it has to do, of course, with the way that people see themselves and how people want to come across to their interlocutors. We now have two more questions.
Marco, may I just quickly follow up on this? Because also being a foreigner who once was taught Russian, when the war started, I started to pick up some Ukrainian words using this Duolingo app. But I'm thinking more systematically about, the foreign community who's also going to be involved in the reconstruction of Ukraine. I would guess that the majority of them, if they know one of the languages, it would be Russian and not Ukrainian. So what kind of efforts do we see now to actually educate foreigners more systematically in the Ukrainian language? So it becomes natural when we come to Kiev that meeting with foreigners is going to be either English or Ukrainian, or not either sort of English or Russian, which would, I think, have been the case quite often in the past. Do we know?
Perhaps, Natalia, you could bear that question in mind, and I'll read the other two questions that are directed to you as well. Again, Uldis asks for Natalia, what is the linguistic landscape of a city like Kherson? Are there opportunities for Russian speakers to practice and speak Ukrainian in various domains without Ukrainian speakers immediately themselves switching to Russian? And then Andrew asks, are there additional considerations on adoption of Ukrainian, such as in Crimea with other minorities? So three rather different questions for you to respond to, but there they are.
Well, in terms of Kherson, yes, there is no study on Kherson in particular, but in 2017, there was a nationwide survey which included the southern region. And what we saw, the nationwide survey conducted by my colleagues from Kharkiv, Karazin University, Yulia Soroka and Igor Danilenko, and we just wrote a paper and submitted a paper on that survey. And the idea of the novelty of the survey was to show how many bilinguals there are in different regions of Ukraine, because usually all the other surveys asked about what is your language of communication, of everyday communication, what is your native language, and this may differ. And this survey asked about which language you communicate in different situations, which language do you speak at home, which language do you speak with friends, which language do you speak at work, and so on and so forth. And thus the people doing the survey, they were able to capture how many bilinguals there are actually, because very often people are not willing to recognize their bilingualism. They think that they should choose. There is only one language. Somehow the ideology is that there can only be one language, or either they try to think in terms of this is the major language, this is the language I use most often. So the idea of the survey was to capture how many bilinguals there are in fact, and it turned out that these regions that we are used to think about as largely Russian-speaking regions, yes, including Kherson, including Odessa, including Mykolaiv, including the whole of the southeast, it turns out that in this region, in fact, the larger number of people are now bilingual, not Russian-speaking people, but bilingual people. And the most of bilinguals were found, more than 50% of bilinguals were found, in fact, to reside in Donbass. This was very unexpected, in Donbass, and the controlled part of Donbass, of course. This is from 2017. And the most of bilinguals, there were a lot of bilinguals in the north, and also there were around 45% of bilinguals in the south, Kherson, Mykolaiv, and Odessa regions included. And there were 8% of Ukrainian, more than 8% of Ukrainian speakers, which in total gives you more than 50% of people being able to speak Ukrainian. So, and when you ask about, is there opportunities for Russian speakers to practice? Yes, of course, there are opportunities, because this myth of Ukrainian as, you know, a dialect, as some kind of rural backward language, I think that in most areas this myth have already disappeared, and people do not associate Ukrainian to some kind of language they wouldn't like to speak or to hear, or they would be ashamed to speak. So you can easily speak, and especially in education, in civil service, in public service, such as restaurants and shops for the workforce, you could easily come and ask for a menu in Ukrainian, and all these people should have been able to provide, because the law passed in 2019 specified all these cases and demanded that Ukrainian be used as a default language. So everyone in public service, in civil service, in education, they start speaking Ukrainian to you when you come. And this works as a motivation for Ukrainian speakers, because if they are addressed in Ukrainian, they feel easy and they continue to speak Ukrainian, and they also answer in Ukrainian, and they do not switch into Russian. In terms of the spheres regulated by the law. In terms of other minorities, what I can say from my own observations, in the free Ukrainian language courses, there were several people, Crimean Tatars, because the largest a minority of Crimean Tatars resides in Kherson, used to reside there in Novorossiysk and Henichesk, because many Crimean Tatars had to leave Crimea after 2014. So the largest mainland minority was found in Kherson region mainly. There were several Crimean Tatars in these courses learning Ukrainian. They wanted to learn Ukrainian. The idea was, what they told was that we all were raised speaking Russian. And of course, we now have schools, and there are some schools in Kherson region teaching Crimean Tatar, and not only teaching Crimean Tatar as subject, but also having all of their classes in all of their lessons. So the immersion kind of education for them. There are just, in fact, according to the statistics, 2 such grades in a parallel, where you find 56 students like that who are educated in the Crimean Tatar language. So they are very much attracted to Ukrainian, and they are looking at this pattern of revitalizing Ukrainian as a model for their own revitalization of the Crimean Tatar language. What I've heard from them is they say, we would like to do the same. We would like to organize similar courses, teaching and expanding the Crimean Tatar language to Tatars as a language of everyday communication. Because now, as I understood, they use, and I was in Novel at Sivka on a one-day trip, and I understood that they use Crimean Tatar now mostly for their church services, mostly as a language of religion, which also shows that this becomes an endangered language if it's just used in one single domain. So they're very much attracted to Ukrainian, and they haven't found any, any bad impressions among them. But of course, I didn't ask every Crimean Tatar. So there is one more question. Speaking Russian, don't
Marco,
make
you're muted.
Yeah. So what are the strategies that one can anticipate to create the situation where foreigners coming to Ukraine find it natural to be communicating either in English or Ukrainian rather than having recourse to Russian as used to be the case 10 years ago and more?
What are the strategies? Can you specify a little bit more? Can you
Tobin, would you like to repeat your question?
I think a lot of diplomats, people from international organization, business people, etc., that are not from Ukraine but go to Ukraine, they may know Russian as a foreign language, but not so many of them have maybe learned Ukrainian as a foreign language. I'm just wondering if we think about Ukrainian courses or education for foreigners, around the world, is there some concerted effort to actually try to replace maybe some Russian classes with Ukrainian classes in Sweden or in Australia or in the US or whatever country we may think about? So that was my question.
Yes, thank you for your question. In the 2019 language law, there is a provision which, according to this provision, there should be Ukrainian language courses created for foreigners. Yes, where again you expect a different approach and a different language pedagogy when you teach Ukrainian as a foreign language. So this is one of the provisions in the 2019 language law, and then this was also reiterated in the so-called plan of gentle Ukrainianization, which was passed last year in 2021. This provision again was reiterated that we should create a network of Ukrainian language courses for foreigners. And it was just, this is something that is planned. So far, this is more of an intention than something that has been realized. And of course, the need for such courses has long been felt, and these courses has long been needed. And a lot of I have one of my former students, in fact, who was trained as a translator from English into Ukrainian. She switched to teaching Ukrainian to foreigners, and she has even created an online language school where she teaches Ukrainian online to many people from all over the world whose first language is English. And she reported on how many people, in fact, have been attracted to Ukrainian language after 2014, and even more people this year after the February invasion. So this is something that is necessary, obviously, but on the institutional level, such courses have not yet been created, unfortunately. And now there are, I think people think that now there are much more important things to do. But again, as I'm looking at this grassroots initiative, then these courses that I just spoke about is a grassroots initiative. People just, ordinary, regular Ukrainian language teachers decided that they will teach Ukrainian as volunteers. They will teach it for free to everyone who wants to learn. So such people as my former student and other people, they provide these opportunities to learn, for foreigners to learn Ukrainian online. So this thing exists. It doesn't mean that there are no such initiatives, if they are not institutionalized.
Yeah, I can certainly say that the President's Fund for Culture, Scholarship and Sport is currently in the process of talking to universities worldwide and working towards creating a strategy to make Ukrainian themes more present in higher education in the world generally. And of course, language education is a fundamental aspect of such sensitization of the world to Ukraine. We'll be finishing soon, but Irena Orap has made a very telling point. Speaking Russian language doesn't make you Russian. Now you speak English and it doesn't make you English. And this distinction between national self-identification and language practice is, of course, something that has been very evident in Ukraine for a long time. Is it the case, Natalia, that speaking Ukrainian is in the process of becoming more important for this kind of symbolic self-identification as a Ukrainian person in the course of this war?
Yes, of course. And as usual, such events, as we are experiencing now, they usually intensify these identification ideologies. So this is quite natural. And as I said, this canceling of Russian and of Russian culture, this is something that we should expect. This should not surprise us. So the identification ideology, I think, will be the driving force now for those people who would like to switch to Ukrainian from Russian, who would like to come and learn Ukrainian. The identification ideology will be the main motivation for them, as it was just after the Euromaidan in 2014. So most of the people who came to the courses, they said that I want to learn Ukrainian because I am Ukrainian. This is who I am. So they refer to the identity and to the symbolism. If you speak Ukrainian, then you are Ukrainian and not anybody else. But of course, then after the law was passed in 2019, there were another wave of people coming to the courses who said that I want to learn Ukrainian because I need it for my job. And this is a different pragmatic motivation, which is also very powerful, which is also very effective. It drives people, it motivates them to learn language. What I've seen from my recent interviews right now, which are being taken during the war, I see that still for people, even if they don't realize it, both of these motivations work for them. So a person may realize the identity thing, as the Russian person, yes, I've just described, said that I want to learn Ukrainian because I don't want to be Russian. So this is the identity thing. I don't want to be Russian, I'm Ukrainian. And then the person started to recall on the relatives, on some ancestors from Ukraine. But then when I had this 45, I think, minutes of interviewing, and then I heard that there is some pragmatism. Because when you say that I don't want to listen to Russian news, I don't want to read Russian papers, I want to read Ukrainian papers, you can hear that there is a pragmatic motivation also. I want to be able to read news in a different language, and this is pragmatism. But there is always these two things that work together, because identity drives you at some particular moment in 2014, now, but then when some other things come to the fore, identity may not be already so important, as so to say. And if you have pragmatism, if you clearly understand why you need this language, you need it for your job, or you need it for this and this and this, what conditions are lasting shift for you. But of course, the symbolism will now be, as I said, the predominant motivation for the Ukrainian language shift.
Thank you, Natalia. and we're drawing towards the end of the time allotted to us, but there's a beautiful story that has just appeared in the question and answer, which I must read. It's from Barbara Kania, who says, "Not a question, but a story about language. I'm from Poland. My friend is a school teacher. Since February, there are many refugees here. She also teaches them. Not only Ukrainian children learned Polish, it took only 2 weeks, and also Polish children learned Ukrainian from their Ukrainian friends. Now, if the children don't want my friend, the teacher, to understand, they all switch to Ukrainian." And I think that might be a lovely story for us to finish the discussion on. Now that we're at the end of today's webinar and also of this webinar series, I'd like to take this opportunity on behalf of the Ukrainian Studies Association of Australia and New Zealand, USAANZ, as is our wonderfully convenient acronym, and its president, Professor Natalia Chaban, to thank a number of institutions and individuals. So first of all, thank you to USAANZ's partners, the Melbourne Eurasianist Seminar Series of the University of Melbourne, and the Ukrainian Studies Foundation in Australia Limited, under whose joint auspices this important webinar series has taken place. Thank you also to my colleagues on the team that conceived the series and organized its program, Dr. Julie Fedor and Professor Mark Edele of the University of Melbourne, as well as USAANZ's Professor Natalia Chaban of the University of Canterbury in New Zealand, and Dr. Alessandro Achilli of the University of Cagliari in Italy. I also very sincerely thank Melbourne University's Dr. Becky Clifton and Felicity Hodgson, as well as Andrew Radion of USAANZ, whose technical and administrative contributions to the series have been crucial and invaluable. And so I'd now like to give the floor, the virtual floor, that is, to Mr. Yuri Suchoversky, the chair of directors of the financial sponsor of the Russia's War on Ukraine webinar series, the Ukrainian Studies Foundation in Australia, because without USFA's grant in support, this webinar series could not have taken place. Yuri, could you switch on your camera and take the floor, please?
Okay, good, thank you. Thank you, Marco. Слава Україні! В імені дирекції Фундації українознавчих студій в Австралії складаю організаторам цієї конференції подяку і гратуляції, що вони склали таку цікаву і якісну серію. На жаль, світ про нас, Україну, досить мало знає, а 3/4 з того, що він думає, що він знає, є мильним. Наш обов'язок є дати світові знати про нас і наші осяги. Такі конференції є дуже великий крок в тому. On behalf of the Ukrainian Studies Foundation of Australia, I would like to thank and congratulate the organizers of this series of webinars on Ukraine. Ukraine is still a largely unknown quantity. When I was growing up, it was something like Atlantis. Some people thought it was a myth, some people believed in it. There was a basis for some interpretation, but no one could be quite sure. There was even a book called The Ukraine, the Submerged Nation. After this war, or because of this war, we have probably now become something like an iceberg. An iceberg, as you know, there's only 10% above the waterline. And I believe that is probably what the world knows about Ukraine. there is still a lot to learn. Hopefully conferences like this will bring Ukraine, will make people more aware of Ukraine, what it has achieved and what it is worth. Slava Ukraini. Thank you.
Yeah, Heroyan Slava. Thank you, Yuri. Before we conclude, ladies and gentlemen, let me remind you that you can view recordings of the first 4 of the webinars in this series online already, and numbers 5 and today's number 6 will also be available online in due course, and you'll receive emails with the relevant links as they become available. And last of all, let me thank this evening's or this morning's, depending on where they are, speakers, most sincerely, on my own behalf, and also on our audience's behalf, for 3 remarkable and thought-provoking papers, and for their generous engagement with the audience. And thanks also to you, the audience, for the excellent questions that stimulated such further interesting responses. Please look out for emails informing you about future Ukraine-related events. Thank you, and goodbye for the moment.